Today we'll learn how to create a mock REST API with the mock service worker package, as well as how to write asynchronous tests with Jest and the React Testing Library. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we will create a mock REST API and write asynchronous tests for a Next.js application. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Before starting this tutorial, I recommend watching my Testing Your Code playlist from the beginning. Today's video will be the fourth video in the playlist, and our starter code today is the completed code from the previous video, and I'll link to that code in the description as well. The goal of today's lesson is to learn about the MSW package known as Mock Service Worker and how to use it with Jest to create a mock REST API so we can write async tests for CRUD operations. We're in VS Code and I have the starter code open. I've already changed the name in the package JSON. I've named this one Next Async Testing, and previously it was the example app for testing, I believe. But I'm going to add a couple more dependencies to the dev dependencies that we have down here today. So let's go ahead and press Control and the backtick to open a terminal window. From here we'll type npm I, then -D, which indicates it's a dev dependency. Then we need MSW, and we also need wg-fetch. I'll go ahead and press enter and explain with fetch, we need that dependency because we test in isolation. So we're going to use that with Jest. We don't have the Next.js fetch available to us while we're running our tests. Okay, I can go ahead and close the terminal and verify that those have now been added. So we have the wg-fetch here, and we have MSW right here. Also worth noting that in this project, up above, you can see the different dependencies here. I'm currently on Next 13.4.19. That may change for you in the future, and you can just check that out. But we're not really looking at any specific Next.js features today. We're all about testing with Jest and the React Testing Library, and then using MSW to create this mock REST API so we can write CRUD operations functions, fetch our to-dos, and all of that stuff. So with these dependencies now added, let's go to our source directory in the file tree, and I'm going to add a new directory inside of it. I'll name it mocks. Now inside this mocks directory, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to name this handlers.ts. Now our other tests with the React Testing Library all ended in .tsx, and that's because we're using TypeScript, and here we're going to have .ts. But inside of the handlers file, we can just end it with .ts. So I'll go ahead and create that. Now to start this file, we need to import REST, and that's going to come from MSW that we've added. Now let's go ahead and say export const handlers. We're going to set this equal to an array. And then it's going to have the different REST endpoints inside of this array. So we'll start with rest.get. And now we're going to look at the endpoint /todos. And after that, we're going to have a function that has a request, a response, and a context. And we use that context to send our responses, such as a status code or JSON, for example. So now I'm going to use an arrow here for the function. And inside the function, we're going to return res, which is the response. And then inside of res, we can say ctx, which is context. Then I can say status. And I can put the status code for the response here, and I'll put 200, which is a successful response. And I'm going to have ctx, also, again, context.json. And now we're going to send our JSON back. Now, if you remember from the previous tutorial, inside of our app directory here, and then we look at the page, we didn't use any type of API. We just started out with some state, and that's in our useState hook. So I'm just going to grab this state that we were using to start the application with, because that's what we will end up loading into the application from the mock REST API. So just Control-C after I highlight all of that. Then I'll go back to the handlers here, and that's the JSON that I'm going to paste in here. So that's what will be sent as the response with this get endpoint. And you can see now we're at the end of that, and I'm going to put a comma here because we can put other endpoints in this array as well. Up here we have the response, or we could put other things in this response, but it's not really necessary at this point. But after that, we can have other things in this array also. So we have the get here, and then after that, I'm going to need the comma right here that I was talking about. So this would allow us to put other possible REST responses or endpoints actually in here. So instead of rest.get, we're also going to have rest.post, rest.put, rest.delete, and so on. Now you can see we have successfully mocked our get endpoint for our to-dos. So I'm going to save this file for now, and let's create another file in this same mocks directory, and we're going to name it server.ts. Here we're going to import setup server, and that's going to come from msw/node, because here we're working in a node environment. After that, we're also going to have import, and we're going to bring in the handlers that we just created in that other file. So that's from /handlers. There we go. And now we're just going to say export const server equals setup server. And we need to pass in handlers, but we don't just pass it in, we need to spread the contents of that handlers array. Remember, handlers was an array, and it has all the different endpoints. So we're just spreading in all of the endpoints that we create inside of that array. Currently, it only has one, but we will add more. Now let's quickly look at the jest.config.js file. There is nothing to change in this file, but I just want to highlight you must have this line, set up files after env. This is important, and it's already in there in the starter code. I just wanted to highlight that it's absolutely necessary. Now after that, let's go to the jest.setup.js file. Here we can add some things. We're going to import the fetch that we added as a dev dependency. So here I'm going to say import, and then it's what wg-fetch. And that allows Jest to go ahead and use this fetch as it runs the test. After that, we also want to import server that we just created. So that's going to come from, and now we're at /mocks/server. Now that we've got both of those, we need to look at the docs for just a moment, because there's a little bit more we can add to this file. And we're back in the MSW docs, and what I want to highlight is what we have right here. This is the before all, after each, and after all. These are available in Jest. There is also a before each that we're not using right here, but we can just copy this really from the docs, because what this does, and it's commented as well, it says establish API mocking before all tests. So that's where we set server to listen. The next one says reset any request handlers that we may add during so they don't affect our other tests. And let's see if we missed something over there. During the tests, so they don't affect our other tests. So that's server.reset handlers. That happens after each test. And then at the very end, after all, it's cleanup after all the tests are finished. Now, note below it says you can use the same code above in a single test suite if you don't wish to establish the API mocking on the global level. But it's very simple to just take all three of these, and I'm going to add the comments as well. Now, we've already imported the server, so I don't need to copy that. And I'll just Control-C, and let's go back to VS Code. Back in VS Code, I'll just paste in the before all, the after each, and the after all right here in our jest.setup.js file, and this will add these globally for all of the tests that we're running. And so now our mock server will always be ready for each individual test. Okay, we flash forward just a little bit, and I have added a lib directory inside of our source directory now, next to the app directory. And inside this lib directory, we have our CRUD functions that we're going to use inside of the components. So these are library functions, and you can see they each have a folder just like we did for the components in the previous video. So that means inside of each folder, we're going to find a file that has the function, and then we can also create a test folder. Let's look at this fetch to-dos function to start off with. Now, of course, this tutorial isn't about writing CRUD operations functions. It's more about the asynchronous testing of those functions and how to do that with the mock REST API. So we'll just fast forward through creating the actual functions, but you can see a basic fetch to-dos function, and it gets that array of to-dos and returns them. If there is an error, though, we are logging the error message, And of course, we're using TypeScript, so we check to see if the error is an instance of error. Then I'm also returning an empty array. And that's because we want an empty array if there is an error. And if we look back at our main component here in the page.tsx, you can see it's expecting a to-do array, whether it's empty or whether it has to-dos in it. Now that we're doing this, we'll be able to remove this from our use state when we come back to this and we're actually testing the components again. But right now, let's just focus on this function. And now let's write a test for it. And we'll have to do that by creating a folder first that starts with 2 underscores, tests, and 2 more underscores. Then inside this folder, we'll create the file that is fetch todos.test.ts. Now, when we were testing our components, they ended in .tsx, and they must. But here, this is just a Jest unit test file, and we can end it in .ts. Now we need to import server, and that's going to come from, and once again, this is @/mocks/server. And then after that, we'll import rest. That's going to come from MSW. And after that, we need to import our fetch todos function also. So there's the 3 imports, and I'll start with a describe block. So we're going to describe, and I'll say this is the fetch todos lib function, which we can see this in the terminal when we see the test results. Helps us identify what we're looking at. Then we have our function here, and then inside the function is where we can write the individual unit tests. I'll start with it, and then I'll say should return the correct number of to-do items. And then after that, we can have our async function, which is an arrow function. And inside of this, I'm going to say const todos array. I'll set this equal to await fetch todos. And after that, I'll say expect the todos array dot length. And then we'll add .2b and 4. So we're expecting our array to be 4. And if you remember, that's what we were returning from our mock endpoint. If we look inside of mocks and look at the handlers, we have an array with 4 to-do items here. So that's what we should receive back when we test this. Now note, we haven't used the other 2 imports here at the top yet, and I will get to that in a moment, but let's go ahead and save this. And let's open a terminal with control in the backtick, and we can type npm test to run our tests. All the other tests are still in place that we had from the previous tutorial, but we should have added this one. It looks like a few failed now, so that's interesting because we didn't have failures in the last tutorial. Let's see what we have for failures here. Oh, the delete to-do lib function. I haven't got there yet, but I've gone ahead and applied that. We haven't created those endpoints. That's why they've failed. We'll get to that in a moment. So actually nothing that we're worried about yet. Those are just things I added ahead of time. But let's see if we can find that fetch todos lib function way up here somewhere after all of the warnings and errors. And here it is, the very first thing that was tested. It should return the correct number of to-dos items, and it did that. Here we can see our description, fetch todos lib function. Now I will get to these others where I've added the tests in just a moment. But let's talk about another test we should add here. This was success. So we received the to-dos array that contained 4 to-dos, and we checked the length, and it was indeed 4. But now let's also check if the request fails. So I'll start with it once again, and I'll say should return an empty array with an error. And that's because if we have an error, that's what we should get, the empty array. And we'll say async, once again, have our function here. And inside of this, this is where we're going to use the server and the rest that we imported. Now, in the handlers array that we have here, this is the default response that we would get at the to-dos endpoint with a GET request. But anything that we're about to add will be added at the front of this array, and so it would essentially override, kind of like with an Express API if you've created one before, if it's going to go to the first path it finds. So if we put another GET endpoint for to-dos in front of this one, it wouldn't use this one, it would use the other one we created. And we can do that on a test-by-test basis if we need to, and that's what I want to do for this failure So let's go ahead and come back to the test. And now we're going to say server.use. And then inside of the server.use, we'll say rest.get. And then we'll have our to-dos endpoint once again. And now we'll have the request, the response, and the context. And then inside of this function, we're going to return a response. And this response is going to have the context.status 400, which will be a failed request. So we're not overriding, I guess, the other one, but we're actually putting this in front of the other get to-dos endpoint. So it's going to use this one. And that's what we want for this specific test. And server.use allows us to do that. So now inside of the test, I'll say, let me get rid of that extra line. I'll say const to-dos array is going to equal await fetch to-dos once again. And that, of course, should cause an error. So we're going to expect the to-dos array dot length, once again, dot to be 0, because it should be an empty array. Here we are, fetch to-dos, and should return an empty array with an error. So that also checked out. So both of those were the way we wanted them. Let's close that terminal window and let's go back to our mocks directory and the handlers. Right now we just have a handler for the rest.get. Then of course we have a comma after that because we can add more to this array. I'm going to put the others in and then we'll quickly discuss these because these look much like Express endpoints as well. So here's just rest.post and we're once again looking at the to-dos endpoint. Now you can see I am awaiting request.json and I'm getting the title out of the body that was sent to this post request. And I'm using that in the response here because title is just going to equal title. And of course we could probably just remove the quotes here and just have it say title and it would be the same thing. But overall we've got our to-do, it's responding with the new to-do. It has an ID of 5, user ID of 1, completed should be false. And this would be the typical response for rest.post that we'll use in tests. And that's what you really want to put in the handlers because remember, that's the default response. But as we learned with server.use, if we need to override this rest.post response, we can do that in any specific test as well. Now let's look at rest.put. It's a little different because the ID of the to-do comes in the URL. So this is a param that we now have. This looks just like Express params as well. And here we're once again getting everything about the to-do actually from the body because it's also sent in the body. So I'm using the request.json, which we're awaiting. So this is an async function up here as well. But you could pull this ID from the URL param as well if you wanted to, which would be request.params. And we'll do that in the very next one for delete. Here you can see the return status is a 200. And we're sending back the JSON with that specific to-do. And by the way, up here, this was a 201. Anything in the 200 to 299 range is a successful return status. And now after that, we have rest.delete. Once again, we have the ID in the URL. That is a param. And here we're using request.params. We don't need to await that. It was right there, so we can just grab it from there. But then notice it's expecting a number. So when I'm sending the ID back, I'm wrapping it here in a number. So it's actually a number instead of a string value when it is sent back. And those are the endpoints. Very simple overall. If you have worked with Express, it looks very much like that. With these endpoints now added to our handlers, and remember, they're already all being imported and spread into the server that we have here, we're ready to look at our other functions and the possible tests they have. So here's our post to do, and it accepts a string, so whatever that to-do description is, and then we're using that string as item here when we post that new to-do. And you can see the new to-do is being posted there. And then, of course, it doesn't post the ID. It wouldn't know that. The server would generate the ID. And then if it's not okay, it's going to throw an error, but we don't catch that here. We want the error to bubble up, and we would catch that in a wrapper function, something in the component. So we just want to throw the error in this function if the response is not okay, and then we return the JSON. So now let's look at the test we would create for post to do. Very much like the structure you saw before. here we have it should return the posted to-do item, and then we post a to-do item and we expect it to be returned as well. And of course, it's returning the full to-do item and it just expected a string. So we just sent in the description, which is of course then sent back in the to-do also. And then it should also fail with an error. So once again, we're using server.use. One extra thing to highlight here in this function though, and then we're using the expect.assertions1. So just in case there was a way the assertion wouldn't be called, then this would create an error because we expect there to be at least one assertion. So we're going to try post to do, and of course we expect it to fail with our server use up here. Then the error would be caught, and then once again we're using TypeScript, so if E is an instance of error, then we have our assertion here with expect the message to equal failed to post new to do. And if we look at the function, that's what happens when we throw the error, failed to post new to do. So we see that right here. And those are the two tests. Now we could wrap this in a describe as well. I believe I did that in the fetch to do. Yes, we had a describe here, so I could just go ahead and copy this, bring this down to the test here for post to do. We could describe it much the same way. This is our post to do lib function, but then we just need to close it out with the curly bracket and parentheses and save, and then it's auto formatted and everything's wrapped in the description. So now we would see this description when we test it and look at the test results as well. Now, as you might guess, update to do and delete to do would be very similar. So we're just going ahead and updating the to do here. It receives the full to do, and we're flipping the completed here as we post it. Once again, throwing an error if it fails. And then when we look at the test is much like what we saw before. Now we need a mock to do instead of just a string. So we go ahead and mock a to do here like we previously did when we were unit testing some components. And then we have a describe here. So I just left it out of that one. And we call the update to do and we expect it to equal the new version of the to-do essentially. And of course we check the failure as well where we expect an assertion, and that looks almost identical to the post failure. And then delete, and I'll find that one here. It's at the top. We have our delete function. Now it just returns the ID, and we expected that to be a number. And so we were checking on all of that. It receives the full to-do though. So here is the delete request. Throws an error otherwise, and we will see much the same then in this test file. And if I'm going too fast for anyone, remember all of this code is available at the completed source code link in the description. But I'm just giving you examples of how these tests are. I think it's a little too cumbersome to write out each one as I go through a tutorial, and probably gets a little boring along the way for everyone. So now that we've got tests, these are Jest unit tests, asynchronous tests, for our CRUD operations functions that are our library functions that we're going to use inside of the components that we've already created in the previous tutorial. So now let's quickly update the application, and we'll start in our home page, the home function. And at the top, we're going to also need use effect. I'm not using anything here like tan stack query or SWR. I'm just going to use effect and quickly call that fetch to-dos function. And here I'm going to make this an empty array to start off with instead of an array that has all of these to-dos that we had before. So there is our use state now. So now let's also import fetch to-dos because we need to call that function. So we'll have fetch to-dos that comes from our lib directory. Now with both of those in place, let's put in a quick use effect to go ahead and request that data. Again, a very simple app here. If I was doing anything more elaborate, I would probably have SWR in place for this request. But here, this is just going to happen at the beginning, so an empty array, and we're going to have an async function that is get to-dos. Then inside the function, I'll scroll for just a little extra room here. Inside our function, let's say const to-dos array is going to equal await fetch to-dos. Now, after we get that, we'll say if to-dos array has, there we go, I'm using optional chaining, but if it has length, then we will set to-dos to the to-dos array that is received. So that's essentially just populating our data when the app loads, because this only happens at runtime. After that, we just need to keep our local state in sync with the server state. But what we haven't done yet is actually call this function that we put into place. So let's call to-dos or get to-dos as well, and we'll save. And now we're finished with the component. So this will populate just like it was before, except it's making an API request instead of actually starting off with that same state in the use state hook. Now let's take a look at the add to do component, and this is where we would use our post to do function as well. So now at the top of this file, besides what we already have, we need to import post to do. That's going to come from our lib directory as well. And then let's scroll down and we can make a few changes inside of the handle submit where this will be used. I'm also going to press Alt-Z to wrap any code over. Now we're going to be able to simplify the set to-dos quite a bit. So I can get rid of everything about calculating the highest ID now. I can also get rid of the return because we're going to bring this all up onto the same line. And then we're not going to need this elaborate to-do creation here that looks like a long object. Instead, we're going to get the save to-do when we call that post to-do function. So I'll go ahead and delete these also and wrap this in the parentheses, but let's get the save to-do that we're going to need to put here. So I'm just going to say const saved to do, and this is going to be equal to await post to do, and we pass in the item. If we don't have an item, we're already exiting right here. And then after that, we can put saved to do here. Now let's go ahead and wrap this, because remember, if there's an error, it was going to bubble up. We weren't catching it in the post to do function. So after all of this, we have got the try block, and then we're going to have a catch with the error. And now inside of this, we're going to say if error instance of error, then we could console.log the error.message. And of course, you could do whatever you want to with it, an alert or anything else. But that's what I'll just add here for this function. So that's the handle submit now with the post to do in place. Now the update and delete functions were both inside of the to-do item component. So this is where we need them. You can see they're commented out right here. I possibly left that in last time, so I'll just delete both of these. I actually think I did. Now that we have them, they're not quite where I previously had them structured here. So let's give them from the right place. It's going to be @/lib/update to do first. So update to do, and then /update to do. That's what we need. So really we could just end this with another slash and delete to do, and we should have the right location for update and delete for their imports. Now I'm going to scroll down just a little bit once again, and I'm also going to press Alt-Z to wrap any code that needs to wrap, and I can see I had commented these out before too. So I'm just going to uncomment the updated to do that is created when we await update to do and pass the to do in. And it looks like nothing here should change as far as the set to-dos. But really, instead of spreading the to-do and the completed to-do here, we could just once again pass in the updated to-do, and it would accomplish what we want, and it's a little shorter, and we're making sure we get this from the request here, the awaited request. And if not, of course, it's going to throw an error. So speaking of that error, we need to do the same thing we did with the other function, and that's add a try block around everything that should be a success. And then we'll have our catch block after that and our error. And then once again, if error instance of error, we could console.log and have our error.message, and you can bet I'm going to copy that down as we go to the next function. So on the handle delete, I will uncomment the await delete to do, and we're going to wrap all of this, of course, in a try block as well. Now there's absolutely nothing to change for the set to dos. We would get the ID back if we wanted it, but we're not really going to use it. We're just going to go ahead and set the to dos as it is right here. But you could actually get the ID back from this awaited delete to do, and then you could put the ID here instead of the to do ID if you want to, but it's of course the same one that's passed in here. So if we get an error, it's going to go down to the catch either way. So we'll have our try block, And then we'll close out that try block. And let's copy our catch block as well and just paste it down here because it's really the exact same thing. And now we've updated our to-do app to use all of these CRUD async methods, or functions if you will. And now we just need to update a few tests really to go ahead and have this complete. And our mock API will greatly impact the integration test that we did for the full app. And if you remember, those applied to the page where it was all pulled together, the root home page. So let's look in this test directory at home.test.tsx. Now, as we look at our integration tests here, we have to think about the new asynchronous nature that wasn't present before we were making these mock API calls. So as we start out, it's essentially the same. We grab the input and we look for the placeholder text. That's fine. And then we get the button and we use a user event to click the button. That's fine. However, after that, where we expect the input to be empty, we have to think about how long that may take. Now let's look quickly back at the add to do component, and we'll see we await the post to do function before we set the item back to empty, which is essentially setting that input to empty. As a matter of fact, it's the last thing here in this function. So it will wait on this to complete before this happens. So with that in mind, let's go back to the test and let's talk about how we could actually wait for this to happen. And what we can do is use wait for. We need to import it as well. So that will come from the testing library, and it's wait for. And we can wrap our assertion, the expect input to be empty or an empty string, in wait for. So I'll say wait for. Now it has a function inside of it. And then we can put our assertion inside of that function. Now the default timeout on wait for is 1 second, and that's all we will need. But if you ever needed it to be longer or shorter, for example, you could adjust that by specifying here timeout and say 2 seconds. It's in milliseconds, of course, something like that. And I'm going to remove that, but I just wanted to show you how you could adjust the time. Now, what happens here is it instantly starts checking this assertion, but it will continue to check it at intervals up to 1 second, or it will continue to check it for up to 1 second at possibly like 50 millisecond intervals, I think is the default. And it won't give up at least until that 1 second is up. So that's what wait for will do, and it will help this test. But then we have just a little bit more. Notice it is a new to-do, and we already have find in here, and that's important, and we can await that because that's async as well. So we know my new to-do is not going to be on the page right away, so we're using screen.findByText, and we can await that. So really the wait for is all we have to adjust in this first test where it says it should add a new to-do. But what if the request fails? We don't have a test here for that. So at the top, we need to bring in server. So we'll import server that comes from our mocks. Then we also need to import REST, and that's going to come from MSW. And we're going to do the server use that we did before for a failed request. So let's start by copying this test where it says it should add a new to-do, and I'll just highlight all of that with Shift and then click. Then I'll do Shift Alt and the down arrow, and it's copied this same test down. But now I'm just going to modify this test. So instead of it should add a new to-do, we're going to say it should not add a new to-do if the request fails. So we can this additional text here to describe this test. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap that down if it was going to go off the screen. We will once again start out with the render home as part of the arrange, but then we can also put in that server use, and I'm just going to paste it in since you've seen it a couple of times before. You could put it before or after the render of the home component, just so it's part of your arrange process here before you get to the assertion. So here we're saying server use, it is a post request when we add a new to-do, and we're going to return a 400 status, which would be a failure. Now this is all going to start out the same. We're going to get the input, we're going to click the button, we're still going to wait for, so we're still using that here, and that would be an empty input. But now at the bottom, where we have data equals await screen dot find by text. Well, we don't expect this to be here. And anytime I don't expect something to be there, I use query by text. And that's because it doesn't throw an error if it's not there. Instead, it returns null. So now I can say expect data not to have text content. We'll change this part too. We'll say not to be in the document. Now let's look at our test for the update, and it says it should update a to-do. Now something we have to keep in mind once again is this asynchronous nature of the API requests, because when we first render home, it won't have that data yet. So it might briefly say there are no to-dos, and that could be an issue here. So instead of get all by role, we now need to change this to one more delete there, find all by role. But now TypeScript is going to have a problem because it doesn't like us grabbing this first element, saying it's an HTML input element. So I'm going to say we're getting an array of checkboxes here. So let's call this checkbox array is going to equal, and now we will await because we're using find. Once again, find is asynchronous. So find all by role, and we're getting all of the checkboxes as an array of HTML input elements. And this is a TypeScript assertion here. So now that we have the checkbox array, let's define our checkbox. We'll set that equal to the checkbox array. And now we'll get the first element from the array. Now TypeScript will be good, and we can still use the checkbox.checked to be falsy. And then we will await the user event when we click here. But now, once again, after this change, we should probably wait for this assertion here. So I'm going to wrap this in wait for. And then inside of the wait for, we can make our assertion. So this is where we would expect it to be truthy, because we would re-render after updating our set to-dos, or updating with our set to-dos. So we've updated the data, it would re-render, then it would be truthy, but of course it's waiting for that API request, or awaiting for the API request to be successful before that happens. Now I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, and instead of copying that down, I'm just going to paste in the new version here for this test, which it should not update a to-do if the request fails. So we're once again having a failed request, but notice I'm doing something different here. I'm rendering the home component, and I need to do that because we need to get the ID from the checkbox before we can actually have the accurate URL, because we send the to-do ID in the URL. So what we're doing here is first getting our checkbox as we did previously in the other test that was successful, and we expect it to be falsy at first. But then since we have the checkbox, we can get the checkbox.id from it. And that's where we had saved the actual ID of the to-do, was in the ID of that checkbox input. And then we can go ahead and form this URL that we are sending the put request to. After we do that, then we can await the user event, which clicks the checkbox, and then we can expect it to be falsy because it should fail. Now the failure happens fairly quickly because, of course, even though it is an asynchronous request that we are awaiting, the mock API is running right here in our local environment. So it's not taking too long. And I've found that I think we can just do this without wrapping this in a wait for as well. And finally, let's look at the delete here. It says it should delete the to-do. But we need to think about this differently once again, because this is once again in the asynchronous nature. So the to-dos won't necessarily be on the page right away. We need to await to start out here. And this is going to be await find by text instead of query by text. And after that, we can say we expect the to-do text to be in the document. That should be fine. And then here, instead of get all by test ID, we should find all by test ID, but we run into the same problem we had there with the checkboxes. So I'm going to call this, instead of button, I'm just going to call it buttons. And after this, I will delete the 0 because we're not getting the first one. We're just going to get all as an array. So let's define button after that. And I'll say const button is going to equal buttons, and we want the first element. And we still have an error here, and TypeScript is reminding me I need to put an await in front of this because it is find all. And now TypeScript says yes, then we can assign the first element of buttons to button, and all is well there. Then we can expect to do text not to be in the document. So all we really needed to change were the finds when we previously had get or query. So now let's add the test if it fails once again. So I'll put this test in and we will review. Very much similar to what we've previously seen. And here we're getting the checkbox array. Even though this is the delete, we need to get that ID, because remember, the delete also receives the ID in the URL. And the only way to get the to-do ID the way this is structured is to get it from the checkbox. So that's what we're doing here to begin with. We're making sure that checkbox is in the document, and then we structure this URL, and we're using the server.use for that. And here we're doing the exact same thing we did above with buttons as well. And once we click the button, now we're checking to make sure that the query by text is still, right code here, is still in the document. So I'm using query by text, which is fine. And then after we get that, we can just check to make sure it is in the document. And that wraps up all of the extra tests we were adding. So we added 3 new tests to where if the requests fail, and we adjusted the other tests just for their asynchronous nature now in working with the API. And that covers the integration tests. But we may have an issue elsewhere, even though those unit tests were isolated, something like we saw here where we actually had to wait for the input to have an empty value might come up in our unit tests. So let's go ahead and run our tests and see what passes and what fails. I'll scroll down through everything here. I'll type clear just to clear some of that up. Now let's do npm test, and let's run these tests and see if we have any failures. And it could possibly come from one of the individual unit tests. No, everything passed, but I do have one in mind, and I was curious if it would pass or not. And I think we might get a mixture where sometimes it passes and sometimes it doesn't. That is in that add to do, where we had a test to check to see if it was empty or not as well, that input. So let's once again take a look here. It should render the input, should render a disabled submit button. That's fine. Should be able to add text to the input, should enable the submit button when text is in the input. Here it should empty the text input when submitted. This could have the same issue as before. And as we saw, we passed, but it's all going to depend on how fast that asynchronous action happens, or how quickly we get a response, really, because we're clearing that input after we await that response. So to make sure, we could go ahead and add wait for up here as well, and then we could wrap that behavior that is expected inside of our wait for. So where we expect the value to be blank, let's put our wait for right here. And now we can put our assertion inside of the wait for function. And this should be the only unit test that we changed that we had for each individual component besides our integration tests here. So let's come back and let's run the tests one more time and just verify that everything once again passes. npm test, running all of the different tests that we have in place. And yes, 31 pass out of 9 test suites. So today we created a mock REST API with the mock service worker package. And then we used that API with Jest and the React Testing Library to test our code with unit and integration tests. Now in the next video, I want to show how AI can help you test your code for complete coverage. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.